We're now going to take a look at the changes to the material editor and working with materials and also getting into the changes in the function editor. I just have a simple scene loaded in, just a sunrise cloud layer. If we take a look at the sea object, I'm going to pull up the material for that. You can see on the top under the effects that everything's basically been converted from text to icons along with a couple of new features up there. On color and alpha, we now have an alpha production that we can access directly and just be able to modify that within the color tab. So that's not really a huge change, it is kind of nice though. If you are upgrading from version 7 and didn't get a chance to use version 7.5, some of these new icons, you might not know what they do, and those are the ignore lighting and ignore atmosphere. Using the ignore lighting would be similar to going to the effects tab, turning off diffuse and ambient, and turning up the luminous value all the way, at least for the direct look. Since the luminous value does affect some of the lighting modes, global illumination, global radiosity, it is a separate feature and was really included for the modifications you can do with camera projection, which we'll take a look at. First thing I want to show you is these two new sliders. What we have are a texture anti-aliasing boost. So if you're having any issues with plant leaves or complex textures, you can now increase the texture anti-aliasing per material, which is pretty nice. The subray quality drop. This is for things like refraction and also reflections. And in this case we have water, where the reflection is tied to the transparency being a turn reflective with angle, default water being the main water surface. So what the subray quality drop will allow you to do is decrease the render time required when calculating these sort of light scatters. So when you have reflection on particularly surfaces that are bumpy, in this case we have the water surface, the rougher the surface is, the less we need an accurate reflection. Same thing with the refraction. It doesn't need to be completely accurate if you have a very displaced surface. So what you can do is decrease the subray quality, and it will speed up render times. It's definitely something more for animation, where you'll notice the bigger decrease in render time or large frames. Most of my tests I really have only seen 1 or 2 second drop, but of course for an animation that's going to make a larger difference. And the quality does appear to be basically the same. And I do want to note that you will need to select, if you're using a layered material, and in this case the water is a layered material, default water being the main water surface and then foam on top of that, you will have to go up to the main material stack and decrease that subray quality. So it is going to affect every single layer of the material, but it's still a per material setting. Because if I was to, let's go ahead and set this back, go to the default water and now just drop for just the default water surface, and now just switch layers and go back, you're going to see it will reset. If that's a bug, I'm not sure. So it may be something that does work in the future where you can just change it, but it will more than likely apply to every single layer, because that's been kind of a typical thing within Vue. So just make sure you go to that top layer and decrease the subray quality if you're going to be making changes to material surfaces. And I'm going to go ahead and add a material or a terrain, and we can take a look at some of the new materials. You can already see that I've got the new terrain preview open. So if you're not familiar with this, how to access or change it, first I'll go ahead and just load in a different material. Load in one of my grass materials. And now we have the option, if we go to Options, to change to the terrain object to be displayed. So the marble has been removed, which was basically just a smaller version of the sphere, not really needed. So the biggest change in here is really just kind of the ordering, and then being able to display the terrain. This is really useful for making changes to things in the Environment tab. So if we add a layer, we'll go ahead and add the large scale rock. And now we can see a little bit better what it's going to look like. If we open up Zoom, we can increase the scale. The material preview, of course, still one of the older features. And now see that we have a much better representation of the kind of effects that we're going to see within the Environment tab. So if I change the slope range, we're now going to have a more accurate preview and give us a better idea of how the material is going to look. And if you do need to change that within the function editor, of course you can edit the function, go up to the top, preview options, and set that over to a terrain. And that will also change the function output observer. The function output observer is actually linked to the main material, so it is not linked to the function setting. The function preview is primarily just for modifying the nodes and previews, and then the output observer is linked to this main material option. So that's of course the same as it was in version 7 and 7.5 and previous versions. And if you do want to take advantage of this with all your materials, you will need to go to File, Options, and under the General Preferences tab, under Preview Options, you can change your material and also your function options that are going to be global. Now this is mainly for when you make a change to a surface. It will update and then use those settings. If you're loading in presets, it's going to use the preset saved setting. So you're not going to be able to see the preview that we currently have up right now. So what you can do is choose the override saved options to automatically make every material you load in update to the new setting. It will be a little difficult if you're working on plants, so you might need to make some modifications if you're going to be working on plant surfaces. But for the most part, if you're working on terrains, primarily it's a good idea to override, and you can get some better previews that way. And I also want to note another change. If we go back to the C material and go to transparency, previously under refraction index there was an option to show caustics. Well, caustics is automatically applied to every transparent surface or a transparent surface with a refraction index. And now the new option is to disable caustics. So it's automatically enabled, and up at the top we have a new disable caustics option, and that just makes it a little bit easier to work with materials that you want to have caustics on for everything. Because for the most part, it doesn't really take all that much time to calculate, unless you have a lot of dispersion or some of the other effects on. So I'm going to go ahead and load in another scene and take a look at the new ignore lighting and ignore atmosphere settings. Some camera projection. So I've loaded in a scene that I already have the camera projection set up for, and what I've done is create 2 or 3 terrains and applied an ecosystem to them, rendered them out, and now the ecosystem and the final render is being mapped onto these terrains. So as you can see, without the render, it's just very simple terrains. And I just want to show you how to set up the camera projection. You can also see that I do have ignore lighting on. If I wanted to ignore the atmosphere as well, then we're not going to see any interaction with any light in the scene. It also will not cast any shadows or receive any shadows. Now this is set up with Matte Painter, which is part of Snowflake. So I'm going to go ahead and set this up for users that are not using Snowflake, also known as the Metanode Collection version 2. So what I'm going to do is add in a texture map node, and we're going to change it to just the texture map, which is going to give us our UV coordinate. And all you need to do is change this UV coordinate to camera projection. And you can choose your camera. So this is set up to the main camera. And then we just need to load in the map. I also want to note that the interpolation type, if you want to, say, project this onto just a plane rather than using an object, if you set this to bicubic, it's going to ignore any sort of texture anti-aliasing and improve the overall speed of the render. If we go to the camera projection node, we can set the aspect ratio and then also the scale. Scale, for the most part, if your camera's not moving, which it shouldn't be, if you're using camera projection, the scale would stay around 1 and 1, so you wouldn't want to modify that. And then you could just set the aspect ratio, which is the x width divided by the y height. So if we had 16 by 9, or in this case I'm using Panavision, which would be 47:20 ratio, so then it would be 47 divided by 20, and that'll give your aspect ratio. So 4 by 3 would be 1.333, and that would be the aspect ratio for that. So then all we would need to do is just connect to the color output, and we're going to be able to set up that camera projection. And also in View 8, we can see that the camera projection is showing correctly. So I'm going to go ahead and copy that material just onto this other terrain. And I do want to note that whenever you copy and paste materials with the camera projection node, you do have to reset the camera and change that. Otherwise it won't work. So we'll go ahead and paste this last material. So you just need to edit the function and then change that camera. So anytime you copy and paste, it will need to be updated.